Okay, so I guess we will start.
Here, evening, you want?
So here I have.
Here.
谢谢。各位同学早。Yeah. So welcome to today's special event, which is we have an invited speaker here. Before we start the talk, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to our speaker today. By the way, 我是梁玉婷老师哈，我的班上的同学还有胡老师的同学，你们一定要签名，好，要签名，签名的单在那边好。Okay, so we're very honored and pleased to have Professor Caroline Frank with us today, and you should already know the title of her talk for today, which is Notes of Travel in Taiwan from the Perspective of an Early Americanist. We're all learning English, right? So we know America, we know American, but then what is an Americanist? Americanist is someone who studies the culture, history, literature, people, societies of the United States of America. And Professor Frank happens to be trained in the discipline of history. So then, here, this is a little bit more about her. Professor Frank, she got her PhD in American Studies, 美国研究, which is a transdisciplinary field of studies that, again, examines the various aspects of American culture, history, people, society, literature, so on and so forth. From, the Ivy League University in the United States, Brown University, which is in Providence, Rhode Island. And she is now currently the Associate Director of the MA program in American Studies at Brown. So I'm very happy that she's here today to know a bit more about the institution where she teaches. And also she's the author of this wonderful book, and the title of the book is Objectifying China, Imagining America, Chinese Commodities in Early America. So in other words, she studied 贸易历史, the history of the trade between China and North America in mostly the 17th century. And that's her area of specialization. And Professor Frank is trained as an early Americanist, okay, someone who studies the history of early America. And her research areas interest includes history of early America, China trade, 和中国做贸易, or we can also say the East Indies trade. And more recently, and also museum collections. And more recently, she is interested in Taiwan, and from a trans-Pacific perspective, and which I put it in as trans-Pacific Taiwan studies. So I guess that gives you a little bit background of who she is and what she does. So without further ado, dear students, let's give Professor Frank a round of applause. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Liang. Professor Liang has been to Brown University a few times, and she's coming again next month to participate in our Trans-Pacific program, specifically our program about Taiwan. Okay. So I like to move around. I feel a little bit like I'm in a cage back here, so I'll try to do this as easily as possible. How many people know where Brown University is? Not very many, no? I'm coming, my trip to Asia this time is to try to interest Taiwan students in coming to study in the United States. So I have brochures about our master's program. If anybody's interested, you come up and see me afterwards, and I can tell you about our program. I would love to have more students from Taiwan come study in the United States. So as Professor Liang said, I'm a historian. I research early America, which is from Columbus through the 19th century. I However, I don't do history the way most traditional historians do it. I'm in an American Studies department, and I'm not sure you all know about the discipline of American Studies, which Professor Liang is also very involved in. But the goal of American Studies, which is a discipline that began in the 1940s, is to look at history and literature from an interdisciplinary perspective. So in my work, I study history, but I use objects, I use art, and I use literature to better understand history, which helps me, when I'm looking at a historical moment, it helps me stand back and see the whole picture better, which is what my talk is about. I think it's very important when we look at historical contexts to be able to step back and to see the whole picture and to understand what our mental framework is, to get outside of our mental framework. We all exist within a narrative structure. We exist in a world that we tell ourselves exists. I exist in the United States of America. I have ideas about the United States because I grew up there. I studied history as a child. The United States is great. It's a superpower. It's it's got the best market economy. We're about liberty. This whole idea of liberty and freedom is so important, is so embedded in our idea about being American. And I'd like to understand that. Where did that come from, that idea? What does that idea do to us when we try to understand our history? And so I'm going to talk about that, about the idea of stepping back from your situation to understand your history. All right, I've been to Taiwan a few times. This is my 4th trip. And often, as an American historian, when I come to Taiwan, people ask, why Taiwan? Why are you going to Taiwan? What does that have to do with American history? For most Americans, we got rid of Taiwan in 1972 when Nixon went to see Chairman Mao. After that, Taiwan was no longer important, and people don't understand, why are we interested in Taiwan? Well, there's a number of reasons, and I'm going to try to answer that question throughout this talk, because I think that Taiwan is very connected to the United States, in particular to the indigenous people, the native people of Taiwan and the native people of the United States have a very close connection. And I'm going to come around to that. But first, I'm going to talk about the kind of work that I do to try to better understand what it is a cultural historian does. So I first came to East Asia. I first discovered East Asia in the ground in the United States. Yay! I did archaeology on early American sites to try to better understand American history. That's a different way of trying to understand the history, is to see the artifacts in the ground and to try to understand the people by looking at what kind of buildings they lived in, what kind of objects they used. A lot of archaeology you find is pottery, ceramics, china. I found a lot of Chinese porcelain. And I was in a site that had a 17th century American context. And I asked, why is Chinese porcelain in this early American site? And everybody said, oh, well, they must have been rich people, because you had to be rich to buy porcelain. End of story. But that bothered me because I thought there's much more to the story. Why are Americans, colonial Americans, the early Americans, using Chinese porcelain? And so I went on to explore that question. Let me see what slide I have next. In fact, there's a lot of Chinese porcelain in early America, a lot of it. This is one of the earliest pieces of Chinese porcelain found in America. It was found in the Hudson River in a The Philippe's family was an early Dutch family that later became English and then later became American. Very important early family. They had a mill on the Hudson River. You see a picture of it there, and you see a picture of the Chinese porcelain that was found near that place. Why did they have porcelain? Here's another early example of porcelain found in the room of an early governor, an early English governor in New England. Also, he has an oriental rug. He's got objects from Asia in his room. That's very interesting. And then you often see around the time of the Revolution in America, you get these walls that have porcelain all over them, as if people are wanting to display their worldliness. To have porcelain. When they would design these closets, so when people would walk in the door, the first thing they would see is Chinese porcelain. That was how you would impress your guests. So what is that about? Why is it that Americans had this interest in porcelain? And not only did they have interest in Chinese porcelain, they had interest in Chinese silk, in Chinese tea, and many, many products from Asia. A lot of products from India. The Tree of Life from India, the design, we find all over early American designs. So this is evidence of global interaction that in traditional histories of the United States, nobody talks about. Asia has been marginalized in Western history, basically. And this was my example of how it was marginalized. So I wrote the book talking about how Asia was significant to the United States. I even think that a desire to master Asian trade contributed to the American Revolution. It was why Americans rebelled against Great Britain, because they wanted to be able to go to Asia on their own without the king telling them what to do, because they saw that there was a lot of wealth to be had in Asia. Here's an example of Rhode Island merchants. Rhode Island is where Brown University is. These are merchants in the town of the country of Suriname in South America. And I don't have a pointer, but if you notice, there's two Chinese porcelain bowls. They are drinking punch, which is rum punch. They're getting drunk on rum punch. And this is, punch is something that is a mixture of alcohol and fruit juice that came from India. There they are with all of these African slaves buying tea for the people back home in America, but getting drunk on rum punch using their porcelain bowls. So you can see how these early capitalists were out in the world engaging with Asian material culture from the very beginning. This is a picture that I often use, and this offers a good example of how art can help us better understand history. This gentleman was an upstanding gentleman in rural New England in 1760, right before the American Revolution. In this picture, we see not only a Chinese porcelain punch bowl on his table, we see him holding a glass with Madeira wine. Madeira comes from Spain. We see his account book that shows that in order to be an upstanding individual that has their portrait painted, you have to have accounts. You have to be a merchant. You see his pipe, because he's trading in tobacco. Tobacco was farmed by African slaves. You see that he has land. He's a landowner. He has a big mansion house, and he has a ship that goes to all over the world. So this picture shows the things that are important to a wealthy, elite American gentleman right before the Revolution. And global commodities were very much part of it. So this just gives an example of how I use art to make a point about history. And I think that sometimes art is a less self-conscious way of understanding history. It hasn't already been authored by somebody else. It's a little more raw. So many of the representations that we see of Asia in particular are quite paternalistic, derogatory, phobic about Asians, and also admiring. These wall paintings are in the front room of a house in Newport, Rhode Island. They are what I call Japan work. And this was a Chinese lacquer styles that were imitated by Americans in painting. So this was a painter in Newport, Rhode Island who had never traveled anywhere, but he perfectly got the Chinese aesthetic in this painting that he did in his living room walls. What was interesting to me was not only that he was so aware of the Chinese aesthetic, but that he depicted scenes of torture. So if you look in the middle picture, you see a man being impaled, and you see the clouds with the sort of sinister fingers reaching out towards him. This is a very dark painting. This is one example. I have a picture of the room there. The whole room is covered with these very dark paintings. So I'm curious why these type of lacquer screens that this is imitating in China are often very happy. They're very auspicious. They wish a rich person good luck. So why did this American, who'd never been to China, turn the Chinese scenes into scenes of torture and very dark scenes? Even the little animals on the bottom are kind of creepy looking. They look like little horror animals. It's not a happy looking scene. So that led me to a lot of questions. I did find that the art of painting this Chinese lacquer was being done all over Europe, and American women in particular like to do this, like a craft, like women sew, women embroider, women paint. This was a craft that American women like to do. This is a book that was published in London about how to do it, and they gave patterns that you could follow. And here are some of the patterns. And look at the top one, very interestingly, is an American, or not an American, an English person, English or Dutch person, beating an Asian man, probably a Chinese man or a Japanese man, on the ground like this. So again, we have this idea of a mentality coming out in art. Americans, all Europeans, were fascinated with Chinese torture. They imagined the Chinese to commit horrible acts of torture. Not that the English ever did that. They never did that. It's just the Chinese. But there was a fascination in Europe and in America with Chinese torture. And here we see a man being tied up to a pole, but in fact he's being beaten by a Western individual. So that's interesting to me. All right, I don't know how to go back here. There we go. I want to go back to this. So that gives you an example of some of the type of evidence that I've used in constructing a history of. I'm interested in American history. I want to find out what Americans were doing. I'm more interested in Americans than I am in Chinese. But they were engaging with Asia. Asia was really important. China was, in the 18th century, a global superpower, the superpower. Yet when you read histories of the United States, early United States, it's only about the Atlantic world. Asia is left out of the story. In a similar way that people don't understand, why am I going to Taiwan if I'm an American historian? What's the point of that? This is a narrative framework. This is a mentality that marginalizes Asia that historians have participated in. I sit on a board that reads applications for funding for research. I read these applications. About a year ago, I read 200 applications for early American history. Only one of 200 had anything to do with the Pacific. People are still thinking that we can understand American history without looking at the Pacific. All right, so I was given the opportunity to work on Taiwan by the Ministry of Education here in Taiwan, who is interested in having American universities teach more Taiwan subjects. So is everybody hearing me okay? Is this still working? Yeah. So our university, I wrote a grant to the Taiwan Ministry of Education trying to get money to do Taiwan projects. Again, people said to me, but you're an American historian. Why do you want to teach Taiwan subjects? And I said, I'm sure there's a connection. And I found a connection. But so that was how I got introduced to Taiwan. And when I began to look at Taiwan, the history of Taiwan, the only thing I could ask is, why not study Taiwan? This country has been a crossroads for many people. It's been colonized by many different groups. In particular, I'm interested in the Japanese period because the Japanese were operating in a framework of Western modernity. So many of the same Enlightenment principles that contributed to what Europe is today, Japan was adopting. And when Japan came here, that was the system that they imposed on Taiwan. So that's very interesting to me. I think that there are many things that happen in Taiwan that can be looked as a case study for bigger global issues that are important. So I wondered why we have so rarely encountered Taiwan in our histories. Early Americans, once they got rid of Great Britain in the American Revolution, they flooded the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean in 1800 had never seen so many people from any part of the world all at once than the Americans who went to the Pacific Ocean. They went to get whales for the whale oil. They went to trade furs. They would go up along the western coast of the United States and get animal furs to bring to trade in Asia. They went to explore islands to map the Pacific because knowledge is power. And the more they could know about the Pacific, the more they could have the power to perhaps be masters of the Pacific. This is one very early voyage, Robert Haswell. I've kind of lost where I am in my notes here, but he argued to the American government that the Pacific was important to the future of the United States. And the United States thought, all right, we've been involved with all of these European empires, but if we move west and conquer the land to the west and conquer that ocean to the west, we can have a sphere that's different than what Europe has. And so there was quickly a big sense of competition with the English and the French and the Spanish. And the Spanish Empire at this time was very weak, but the Spanish had been in the Pacific long before anybody. There was quickly a competition to who could get more islands in the Pacific, who could be there in a bigger way. And so this voyage, Robert Haswell's voyage, was one of the very early ones. He went to get fur in Alaska, take the fur, bring it to China to trade, and along the way explored many territories. The exploring was very, very important to the American empire. Here's a ship's log, which I've looked at a lot of what they call these ship's logs, the journals of the sailors at sea, because they have lots of pictures. I love art. But they also tell us a lot in a day-to-day way of what was going on. And here he says he's very upset with his captain because the captain sailed right by an island without stopping to survey it and to write down all the dimensions and then to give it a name and claim it for the United States. He says, the island was just discernible off the northwest corner of the ship. What our captain's motives were for not stopping, we are at a loss to account. For as islands not laid down on the chart ought to be considered as new discoveries. So this island was not already on any map. They found an island that wasn't on a map. And they thought, okay, this is a new discovery. The United States discovered this island, so we map it and we claim it. It ought to be minutely surveyed, he says, their situation, soil, and productions. But the distance we are from it now prevents us from doing that. So he's very upset with the sea captain that they didn't get to stop and write all this down. There's no mention of the fact that there was probably people living on that island. That doesn't matter. I mean, those people don't matter. This is the colonial mentality that Americans, as Anglo-Americans, were bringing into the world with them. Europe was modern. Europe was free. Europe was the people who knew how to cultivate land. This is a discourse that had been occurring since the very beginning of colonization of the Americas. It was only the Europeans who knew how to take care of the land, and therefore they had a right to claim it. In the year 1808, after the French Revolution, after the American Revolution, the French started printing wallpaper of places all over the world and selling it. The first place that they did a wallpaper for, and you know I'm interested in what people look at in their rooms, right? What's on their walls. So this wallpaper was printed by the French, and it's called Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacifique, the savages of the Pacific Ocean. So it depicts, you can't see the writing on the bottom that tells you the island that each one of these panels represents. But this wallpaper is about 20 panels. It goes all the way around the room. Each panel depicts a different island. It is based on writing from Captain Cook's voyages into the Pacific and other American explorers' voyages into the Pacific. And I'm very interested in the vision that is depicted here of the Pacific. This wallpaper was very, very popular in the United States. Many homes had this wallpaper. Here we can see it in one early American home. There it is in another early American home. What's interesting to me about the idea of the Pacific that this wallpaper gives is that it's a very lush environment. It has many resources, coconuts, plants, fish, a lot of good products for US merchants. It's like a big bread basket, as we say. It's open for the taking. Anybody can come take all of these wonderful, lush fruits. It's a very productive environment. The people who are depicted look very happy, very docile, very welcoming, not threatening people at all. There's no weapons. In fact, they're dressed up like Greek gods and goddesses, dancing in their little clothing. And also, based on the French Revolution, I've analyzed this. There's an equality of men and women going on in this wallpaper. Native men and Native women are all, they eat together, they dance together, they climb the trees together. So this is an image of the people of the Pacific as living in a very rich environment and being very friendly, being very open to anybody who comes. This wallpaper would be perhaps in the dining room of an American home, so the children would be there and be able to see. I didn't put up be able to see what the Pacific looked like. This is an education that all people in this American home would be able to see, to understand the Pacific. There was a 40-page book that came with the wallpaper describing the people of the Pacific as being very open, very loving, and they have a very rich environment with lots of things. So this is an early education for young Americans about what is happening out in the Pacific. You don't need to go out in the world to understand that this is what the Pacific was like. What's interesting to me in these 20 panels is that Taiwan is not represented. Now, isn't Taiwan a Pacific island? So I went back and looked at many historic maps of the Pacific, and lo and behold, often the island of Taiwan, or Formosa, as people called it, it's not there. It's left out. So that's interesting to me. It's left out for many different reasons, one of which is that for a good part of the time, it was claimed by China and considered to be China, and so it wasn't available for people. But I don't think that anybody was worried about the Chinese, especially after the Opium War. I think more of the reason that Taiwan is left out, the reason that people say to me, why are you going to Taiwan, is that it was always treacherous. The natives here were armed, and their shores were infested with pirates. Throughout the early Republican period after the Revolution, there was many American merchants, many English merchants in the waters of the China Sea and the Straits. And people saw that Taiwan had a especially resource-rich environment. There was camphor, there was rice, there was tea, there was coal. There were many things in Taiwan that people wanted. But in almost every Western account, and now I'm quoting from a historian, in almost every Western account that confirmed the lack of law and order on the island, there were land robbers, clan feuds, and savage aborigines, and rendering the roads almost impassable. You couldn't go anywhere or you'd be attacked. Along the coast, there were pirates who terrified the fishermen and ravaged villagers and traders. So Taiwan, the waters around Taiwan are rather treacherous. There's many, many shipwrecks. When the ship wrecks near the coast, the people from the ship go on shore if they don't drown. And then there's the natives. And often the natives came and they wanted to rob the ship and they killed the people. And that happened over and over again. Therefore, Taiwan is not on in these beautiful scenes of the Pacific. It's a little bit different. Nevertheless, the Americans, by the mid-19th century, after the Opium Wars in China, but before the Civil War in the United States, pushed very hard at the US government to make Taiwan a colony of the United States. This is something that the United States was doing in the Pacific. They went after Guam, they went after the Mariana Islands, they went after Samoa. You know, there's other islands in the Pacific, and the Philippines, of course, that the United States ended up getting definitively from the Spanish. As European powers do, they give away places regardless of who's living there. So the Americans came into possession of the Philippines. So many Americans in the mid-19th century also wanted to own, they wanted to take Taiwan. Commodore Perry, Perry was from Rhode Island. He had a slave plantation in the South of America, and he took a ship and went to Japan and opened Japan in 1850. This was a really big moment. Japan had been closed to trade. Everybody gives Perry credit for having opening Japan, although the Meiji Restoration that was in Japan at the time was very interested in outsiders. So it wasn't only Perry. Perry just happened to get lucky. So he went to Japan. He had a very good experience opening Japan, as we call it. And then he went to Taiwan. And he thought, whoa, there's this place. He saw that there was a tremendous amount of money to be made in the coal industry and the rice industry. And he saw that there were Chinese officials in the seaports, in Keelung in particular, and that there was a lot of corruption and the money was going into other people's pockets. And he saw that the Chinese presence in 1850 in Taiwan was very weak. And so he went back to the US government and said, this significant island, though nominally a province of China, is practically independent. That means that we can take it. It's independent. A large portion of the island is in possession of independent tribes, Aborigines, who he called independent. A large portion, okay, and yet such is its productiveness, estimated at $1 million. So Perry is thinking, and he's one of many traders who went back to the US government at this time, beginning in about the 1830s, going right up to the Civil War, arguing very hard to the US government, we need to take Taiwan. And they almost succeeded. In 1860, a 119-page report was submitted to Congress outlining all the reasons that the United States should move on Taiwan, should take Taiwan. The number one reason was were the resources of Taiwan, the camphor trees, the tea, the rice, the coal. But then there was also its strategic location along all of these Pacific shipping lanes, close to China, but also anybody who was doing business in the Pacific could stop here if we had a friendly relationship with the native peoples. Oh, and there was also the little idea about converting everybody to Christianity. So this is absolutely standard, age-old Western, the Western trio: military colonizers, merchant capitalists, and the godly men, the missionaries who want to convert people to Christianity. Because so we have the military guys, the capitalists, and the missionaries. Once you convert everybody to Christianity, they're much more liable to play your game. If you have the same religion, it makes it much, and so there's no question that it has to be our religion. It couldn't be their religion. So this 119-page report given to Congress, did I lose it again? All right, in any event, the Civil War happened in the United States and everything fell. It was the end. And so there was no further attempt to argue in the government to take Taiwan because the government was very busy. And it wasn't long before the Japanese moved on Taiwan, and then it was not going to happen. I'm very interested in the Japanese period, but I'm not going to talk about that right now, except to say that the Japanese who colonized Taiwan and the other regions, I think Korea in particular, were operating very much within a Western colonial framework. They wanted to be an empire like they saw the Europeans. And they came to Taiwan and they imposed certain structures that are very much in keeping with the Western mentality. There were Japanese anthropologists who had been trained in Europe. And because of that, they had a certain way of looking at native peoples, which was very Western, which is basically looking down your nose at them as people to be studied. And so this is the area that I want to continue work on. I'm just beginning work on the Taiwanese natives. Hello, let's move. We find in US museums, US anthropology museums, many artifacts from Formosa. This comb is one example. It's at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University. It's an exceptional piece of woodwork. They have, I don't know, 36 combs from Taiwan. They're filed away in cabinets. And you know, one asks, who made this comb? Who used it? Where did it come from? And why is it in a museum at Harvard University? That's a very puzzling question. It is in the true Western style that the Japanese participated in. It's been cataloged. It's given its place, its title, a long number, a culture period. This is a Paiwan, I'm probably saying it wrong, but a Paiwan comb. Other than that, it really doesn't give you very much information. It doesn't tell you the thing I'm always interested in. Who took this comb? How did they get it? Did they pay for it? Was it a friendly interaction? I mean, why is there a comb from the Paiwan Indians in this museum in Harvard in storage? There's the storage spaces. The storage spaces are accessible to scholars and to students, but they're not accessible to the public, and they're certainly not accessible to the Taiwan people. These storage areas are very elite spots. You have to write a letter to someone at the Peabody Museum to tell them what your research is, and they'll take you in and you can do it. So I began researching the Taiwanese native peoples, the Aborigines, as you call them. And I found that similar to the Indians in the United States, about 2.5% of the US population and 2.5% of the Taiwan population is indigenous people. Similar percentages in Canada and Australia also. Moreover, there's other similarities between the US natives and the Taiwan natives. Both experienced a demographic reduction when the Westerners arrived. And here you can see this is for the American Indians, it's a really dramatic fall off what happened. In the year 1500, when Columbus arrived, there were about 5 million Americans in the Americas. In 1900, about, 400 years later, there are 375,000. That's genocide. I mean, that is absolutely genocide. For many years, the European governments in the Americas have said, oh, there was smallpox, there were diseases. The Indians caught the diseases from the Europeans. But when you look at the numbers, it's very much more death by war than by disease. That population figure has started to go back up again in the United States. Today we count about 2.5 million American Indians. And there's a very similar graph for the Taiwan Aborigines. I don't think I was able to find one. But the reduction in population was not as dramatic, but it did definitely occur, especially in the Japanese period. Let me see if I have some numbers. Maybe you all could tell me those numbers. But again, like the American Indians, in the 1980s, there was a rise again in population. And you can see that similar to the United States, it became really cool to be native after the 1980s. And one thing that the government in Taiwan has done, and my travels in Taiwan have been around to try to visit native sites, to try to get to know more about how native materials are displayed in museums here and how they are displayed actually in villages where the native people live. I'm going to skip that for a moment. This is an Ayatol cape that's in a museum at the Peabody and Harvard. What's interesting to me is that native materials are displayed in anthropology museums, whereas this French shawl, this French red shawl, is displayed as art in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So this is one of the problems I'm going to be looking at with students, why certain people's materials are in anthropology museums and other people's materials are in art museums. That's the Oceana Hall. So in trying to find native objects here, I went to the National Museum, the Anthropology Museum at National Taiwan University. And I don't know if you all know this story, but they have this really interesting houseboat, this beautiful houseboat. I think it's about a century old. And you could stop me if you know this story, but the museum, in trying to do the right thing, since the 1980s, everybody has been trying to be nicer to native peoples. And so the museum went to them and said, do you want this back? This is a spiritual object. And the native people thought about it, and they said that, well, actually, it had been living there for 100 years. Maybe it was better if it stayed at the museum rather than be moved. It didn't show up. I have a picture of the president of National Taiwan University being married to the house post because the native people said, you can keep the post, that's fine. We don't want to bother it, but it would be more appropriate if she was married to the man of the house. So the president put together a marriage ceremony. I think somebody stood in for him in the ceremony, but he married the house post. So this is one example of efforts since the 1980s of reaching out to Native peoples and trying to work with Native peoples. I think it would be better if the house post had stayed in their village to begin with. And how it got to the museum is a question I ask. What do we do today with these objects in museums that were collected under this colonial framework, this colonial mentality? Do these objects still have that in them? Is that part of their soul now, the colonial violence that contributed to their being in the museum to begin with? That's a question I want to explore. So I also visited the Institute of Ethnology at Academica Sinica. There's many attempts to fairly present Native people, to work with Native people in how you present their objects. I went to the Shengyi Museum of Formosan Aborigines, which is a private museum. It's not a public government museum. And there are many museums like this, both in the United States and then this one in Taiwan, where you have a rich individual. This was a rich man who started this museum. He had a lot of money. He bought objects from either on the auction markets or directly from tribal people to put in his museum because he was fascinated with the Aboriginal people. So I'm interested in how that collecting activity happened to begin with, and then what does he do with it? These materials are everyday objects for the members of these people, and now suddenly it's being put on display, like on a wall, so people can look at it. What does that mean? What is going on there? Why are people doing that? Why is that a way they want to deal with Native people? By putting their objects on a wall to look at. I went to the National Taiwan Museum also to evaluate how they represent the Native peoples in their exhibits. And then one of the problems with what's been happening in Aboriginal villages, I went to villages around on the East Coast and in the South, and one of the problems is the government is turning them into tourist sites. There are Aboriginal theme parks, Aboriginal cultural festivals, advertised on the side of buses and TV and on radio songs featuring Aboriginal pop stars like A. May, if I said it right. There are TV news reports about Aboriginal cultural activities. Aboriginal programs now appear on public television. And the street in front of the presidential building was renamed in honor of the Katagalan people of Taipei, an acknowledgement of Aboriginals peoples. This sort of acknowledgement was unthinkable under previous historical periods. So this is new. Right now, it's really cool to be Aboriginal. But what does that do for the people who are having their culture appropriated in this way? The same thing has happened in the United States. You know, we've got a baseball team named the Indians. We have many other appropriations, some more sensitive than others. And then the Native Americans pushed back against this. You know, this is our culture, this is our thing. I mean, you've got to stop representing us like we were animals or objects, or the Native people have become like a commodity, like a material. It's another form of conquest, I think. This representation can be another form of conquest. You ascribe a status to people by putting their objects in museums. I think that's about all. I mean, I went to this village on the east coast, of Bunan Village, where I saw this performance with microphones, and they were singing pop songs. It was really quite cute. Lots of children dressed up in traditional clothing singing pop songs. Many Chinese tourists were there watching, also some Taiwanese tourists. It was an interesting situation. I hope it makes some money for the Aboriginal people. I'm not sure about it, though, and I'm not sure what happens to the traditional culture in these sorts of settings. There's also the Taiwan Indigenous Peoples Culture Park, which, like the National Museum of the American Indian in the United States, is run by Native peoples. But it's very Western in its presentation, in its representation of its peoples. Here's a Native person telling me about the male and female Paiwan pots. It's a very important ritual piece of ceramics. Here are some performers at a hotel that we stayed at in Hualien. They put Aboriginal performances in places like hotels at night to entertain the guests. At that Bunun Cultural Park where I saw the performance, there were also wood carvers. And I'm especially interested in the wood carving because we have in the United States many wood carved objects from the 19th and early 20th century. And this is an art form that's still being practiced today by Native peoples, and it's very impressive, very beautiful objects. I can see why people would want to collect them. Here's some more pictures of these objects. This one I really like. This is a traditional Pawan, not a Pawan, I think this was, well, this was in Bunun area in the East Rift Valley. I can't remember the particular tribe, but this is a 7-Eleven done in the traditional framework of a traditional Aboriginal home. And so you see the coming together of, you see this cultural mixing happening in an interesting way. Here's some cultural mixing also, where you see an Aboriginal person with Western or European arms. Oh, here we have the house post that I was talking about, and the president getting married to the house post. That's not the president, actually. That's one of his employees who stood in for him in the wedding. But I also encountered some Native people who, apart from the tourist aspect of things, are trying to rebuild their culture and trying to revive the language. About 10% of Aboriginal people today speak their original languages. And so there's a lot of work going on outside of museums or even in museums. They use museum spaces to try to revive their own culture for themselves. And this is really parallel to what's happening in the United States. So there's an interesting global phenomena here. This is an inn that we stayed in, I don't remember the town, but it was a very small town in the south that was a native Paiwan town run by a community leader who is a descendant of an important Paiwan tribal chieftain, as we would say. I don't know what you call them for Aboriginal people, but a really nice outdoor space that serves for people to just come and meet, and it has traditional native carvings there. And so this is something that I'm exploring further. It's research I'm just beginning. I'm going to be teaching about comparative Native American cultural representations and Taiwanese Aboriginal cultural representations. But I think that we're linked, the United States and Taiwan, in this respect, that we had a large Native population that has been colonized by Western powers, and I'm including Japan in the Western, and are experiencing a similar sort of revival today. And so I want to better understand this global phenomenon. And in fact, I'm working within the framework of global indigeneity, which is something that many countries around the world now are realizing, that their indigenous populations experienced similar types of colonization to other ones. And the UN has got groups now that are working to preserve indigenous rights with the acknowledgement of this common phenomena of Western colonization. All right, I think that's about it, and I'd be happy to take some questions. Okay?
Sitting here, thank you so much, Caroline, for this wonderful talk. And so I guess we would like to have some, questions, further clarification from the audience. If you have questions or anything that you'd like to ask Professor Frank. Yeah, go ahead, please push the button so we can hear you. Can you say something about yourself first, like your name, your major?
Hello, my name is Natasha, and I study in Applied Chinese. And I have a question about what you have just raised, the question of we were introducing the Aboriginals' culture to the public in putting their necklace or things in museum.
Mm-hmm.
And because I have a question about this, then what I know a friend which is an Aborigine in the Amis tribe,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a party like 丰年祭, like they will celebrate their
It's a celebration.
harvest.
Yeah.
Yes, and
Right.
that ceremony cannot be participated by people who is not from the Amis tribe.
Mm-hmm.
Then what is the proper way to introduce this culture to our public and to make we aware of we have the responsibility to protect this culture?
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why does the public need to be introduced to this?
So that we can be more aware of those Aborigines, their cultures might be neglected by Taiwan.
Right.
By us.
Right. I think the neglect is, can you hear me? Is this working? Neglect is the wrong word. I think the cultures have been attacked by the modern governments. And so we need to be aware of their importance to people in order to respect them. But I think that we should back up a little bit and just respect other people's practices, period. I think that, maybe I'm an idealist, but we need to learn how to live together. And I don't think that the Amis people should have to take their cultural traditions on stage and perform them with a microphone to be able to have them respected, unless they want to. Perhaps they're interested in sharing their culture with other people. We have this incredible curiosity about the Aboriginal culture. Just like the American sailor had the curiosity about the island that his sea captain passed by. He wanted to stop and map it. We want to map things about other people, but that knowledge is a way of power also. And so perhaps some of these Amis rituals are private. Perhaps they're not the business of everybody. And perhaps the government should respect the Amis heritage without having to see them perform on stage.
I have a question. So you show us the comb that is on display at Peabody Museum in Harvard University. So we students in Taiwan, we all know Harvard University, right? It's the #1 best university in the world. But I don't know if you have found out anything. Yes, you mentioned that there are a dozen right? Combs.
3 dozen.
Yeah, 3 dozens of this kind of combs that are, according to the tag, it says from Formosa. I don't know if you have done research and so why do they come, from Taiwan and be taken and then, be in the collection in the Peabody Museum, which is part of Harvard. So I would like to know if you have found out the answer, why the Peabody would have the collection of all these combs originally made by the tribal people on this island.
Yeah, they have more than combs. They have hundreds of objects from Formosa. I would imagine that I don't know how they got to Harvard because nobody recorded that. The goal of this collecting activity was to give knowledge to Western people about those people. They did not look at what they were doing. They didn't record the fact that this was merchant so-and-so who went to Kaohsiung, met with these natives, bought these objects, or raided the village, attacked the village and took the objects. That wasn't important for them to know about. And so that's lost information. And it's so frustrating. Mr. Peabody himself was a very big collector of Native American objects, as were a number of other rich Americans. The man who started the National Museum of the American Indian, now run by Indians, but overseen by the government, but was begun by a private individual who bought millions of dollars worth of objects from American Indians. And there is no description of who he got them from, what happened, which agent of his was out there. And this is especially true for objects from Oceania. So interestingly, Formosa doesn't show up as part of the Pacific very often, but in museum collecting, it's put in the category of Oceania. Aboriginal peoples are part of Oceania. And there is no description. That information is lost. And so, that's work I would like to do, is really go back. That's the kind of archival work that historians do. I will read accounts, perhaps, of Mr. Peabody. I'll read his papers and try to find out if I could learn a little bit more about how these Formosan objects came to Harvard. I think that's important.
In this regard, the 顺义台湾原住民博物馆 that you mentioned, which is a private museum run by the family of the Lin 顺义先生. So I guess this is very similar to Mr. Peabody, right? In terms of the cultural objects collection. So
there was a rich man who bought things for.
钢铁大王吗? Does anyone know? Or 汽车大王? Who is apparently a rich man, and he is interested in Aboriginal cultures. So he started to collect, and he eventually got so many, right? So he put them, all on display in this 顺义原住民文化博物馆. So in this way, I see the comparison, similarity
right.
between the Peabody and Lin 顺义. Okay, so maybe someday the Lin 顺义Museum, will be donated to
the government,
National Taiwan University, which is a Harvard, right, of Taiwan, and then Lin 顺义then will become, part of the museum will become, property of the university, as in the case of Peabody Museum, which is part of the Harvard U.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So you see the similarities in terms of cultural collection, museum collections.
Actually, I will say that the 4 museums in Taipei that I noted, the NTU Anthropology Museum, Academia Sinica Institute of Ethnology, the National Taiwan Museum, and Changyi, I think that the level of sensitivity to the native populations is better than it is in the United States. It's quite a bit better, and I'm not sure why. I'm interested in that. That has something to do with Taiwan, that this wealthy man, whose name I'm not remembering, collects these objects, but the display is really quite sensitive. I'm going to next winter, I'm bringing Brown students to Taiwan to study this very topic. And we're going to go to these museums, and I'm going to have the students look critically at the labels, at the displays and try to find out what's going on here. And so I'll have more to say after that. But I think it's quite well done. However, it's never pleasant for anybody to have your daily objects. If I were to have my necklace or whatever put in a wall on display, that's kind of unpleasant, to be represented. So, I mean, there is a sensitive way of doing it, but it's still making people into objects. And they're not calling these objects art. It's a different kind of curiosity than what we have for art. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm also from the Applied Chinese department. And my question is, I think the Taiwanese government is now trying very hard to connect the Aboriginal culture with the Taiwanese people. Like we have a park called Formosan Aboriginal Culture Village in Nantou, and elementary students in Taiwan often go there to a field trip, but I think the problem is the students who go there often focus on the amusement facilities there rather than the culture part. So is that a big problem, and the Taiwanese government should really try hard to fix that?
Yeah, I agree, but I think that the Taiwanese government needs to try also to, there's been a lot of improvements in education. I mean, whether we like it or not, we're all living in this modern world with many standards established by the colonial governments that I'm talking about. Our education system is handed down from that. And so I think that the Taiwan government needs to work to have more Aboriginal students in the university. Do I have, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I'm wondering how many people here are of Aboriginal backgrounds. So it's fine for the elementary school students from Taipei to go visit the cultural park, but it has to go both ways. And like in the United States, the American Indians tend to be at the poorest level of society. They suffer from a lot of racism, job discrimination, housing discrimination. They have a lot of problems, health problems. Health problems are really big, partly because they've had all their land taken away. And so I don't know in Taiwan the degree to which the Aboriginal people experience the same thing. So I think it's important for the government to focus on that, to help us not live in a racist society. Oh, you have a question?
Yeah. My name is Brian.
Hi, Brian.
My question is now related to a slide. There's a news happened a while back. I don't know if you know this. There's a school, a high school in Taiwan, and in their school parade, there's a class of students who cosplayed as Nazi soldiers.
Ooh.
And they even have this cardboard-made German tank. And the most ironic thing is their history teacher is actually standing on the German tank and leading the class of students through the parade. And of course, this event was posted on the news, and it received wide criticism. And these kind of things does actually just happen in Taiwan. I read a newspaper in Japan, Thailand. The teenagers seems to view the Nazi symbols as a rebellion, a thing of being cool, but actually not in the western part of the world. I mean, I was just curious, what do you think are the reasons cause this kind of difference of perception toward this subject matter?
I think that's really interesting, and I think it's related to what we're talking about, because the Nazis were probably the most insensitive government in the history of ever, especially to ethnic minorities. There is actually a global trend towards fascism right now. We see it in the United States with the election of President Trump. We see it in many European countries. There's a hardening going on in China, I dare say so. We see this sort of fascist wave happening. I think that you have to be really careful about representing the Nazis in that way. I think the teacher was absolutely wrong to get, so yeah, the Nazis were a particular culture, but, they were fascist. They were, you have to take it seriously. Fascism is very, very dangerous. It's not something that people should play with. And it's extremely worrisome what's happening. And I'm sorry I can't speak to the differences between the acceptability of fascism in Asia compared to the West. But I mean, right now you're finding a lot of people, a third of our population voted for President Trump, who's a fascist individual. So, it's becoming very popular in the US too. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I have a question. Talking about President Trump, this is a new phenomenon, for global, citizens, people from all different countries, right? I guess, I'm not sure our students, okay, but I guess maybe you can tell us from a more objective way, because he is loved by thousands of voters in the United States. That's why he was chosen. He won the election. But also right after the election, there were many protests going on, marches of various kinds. And also the latest update that I have is that the news says, okay, that he's going to close, to cancel, to the budget, okay, for the national endowments of arts.
No.
I don't know if you
I know.
read it or not.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's like 台湾的总统把文化部的预算全部砍掉, something like that. Okay, we have a Ministry of Culture. It's like that the national budget. Okay, would like to eliminate all the budget. Okay, that's originally prepared for. The Ministry of Culture, something like that. Okay, so can you explain to us, that this is, everything we know is like from the news, but then there's apparently a gap. Lots of people love him and want him to be the president. But
Right.
on the other hand, there are lots of people who find him to be problematic. So why
Yeah.
is that?
It's something that I and many of my colleagues, my family, we've tried to understand what's happening, because it's like the worst nightmare you could imagine to have this person as president. I think that one way that I explain it is the gap between the wealthy and the poor people in the United States is wider than it's ever been. We have many people who are not making enough money to live on. There's a lot of people who struggle and suffer on a day-to-day life from very high levels of stress from not making enough money. There's, in addition to that, speaking to the educated people who voted for Trump, there is a high level of, I would say, selfishness. There's a cultural trend towards selfishness right now. You see it on Wall Street, in our banks and our financial institutions that want to make more money for themselves and not give it to other people. Trump is part of that. I think this is there's many theories about why we've become more selfish now than we were before. One person I read blames the baby boomers, the generation of people who were born after World War II, born into a very prosperous time, were used to, and it was also the first generation in the United States where children were indulged. Children were treated like they were absolutely the best and never punished, and that was a philosophy of child rearing. So this generation has grown up and they've become the heads of corporate entities that are stealing money from people, that know how to extract as much money as possible from people. People don't have enough money to live. And so what these people are doing, they're still pretty comfortable. This is America. They have televisions, they have computers, they're on the internet, they're watching TV, and there's a kind of fire that gets lit by TV and by not necessarily fake news, but these sort of right-wing radio broadcasters, television broadcasters who get people angry, and people start to think that it's the fault of the Mexicans, it's the fault of the Muslims, it's and they also think it's the fault of the U.S. government. They hate the government. The government just makes them pay high taxes. And here comes Trump. He's a complete outsider. He looks like a very successful businessman. He talks the talk. He's got the good talk. He knows how to talk to these people who only want money for themselves. Some of them need it. And he's different. He's outside the government. And the American people are completely fed up with our government. And Obama is a very decent person. But we had 8 years in which he had a hard time getting things done. The government stalled. And I think because many of our congressmen, the people in our government, couldn't imagine working with a black man. It just made things much too difficult. And I think that Obama was, one, inexperienced, and he was a racial minority, which there's a tremendous amount of racism in our Congress. And so the government stopped. So the government hasn't been working very well, and people know that. And people saw Trump as the answer. He's somebody different. But I don't think that what he's doing should be taken lightly. It's very, very serious. It's very dangerous. It's a huge setback. To take away the National Endowment for the Humanities is a disaster. I want to go live somewhere else. It's just terrible.
So maybe one last thing that I'd like to ask you, if you can go back to the Sea Captain carousing, that big painting.
Oh, I love that painting.
Yeah. So
it's on the cover of my book.
this is So then, can you?
It's a great painting.
Right. Can you tell us? We don't have a pointer though. Can you tell us where are the two? Are they the plates, or the jars, or the?
Oh, okay.
Porcelain
Okay, the porcelain.
The objects.
I'm out of my prison. Okay, here's a porcelain bowl right here.
Oh. Okay.
There and there. Right there's a porcelain bowl, and right there's a porcelain bowl.
Okay.
He's a big slave trader from Providence, one of the founders of Brown University. So he's an important man. Then the rest of these guys read like a street map of Providence. They are all the founding fathers of Providence, Rhode Island, where Brown University is. And they're there illegally trading for Chinese objects because Suriname was Dutch and they weren't supposed to be there. It was not English. So, but yeah, you see the pipes and the alcohol and the punch that they're drinking the punch and they're getting very drunk. The artist was actually there. Greenwood, John Greenwood was the artist. He was from Rhode Island and he was there. And so while he was there having this party, he did a drawing that he later made the painting of. And this painting is in the St. Louis Museum of Art. It was bought away from Rhode Island. But it's great evidence of illegal trading during the British period, of trading in global commodities, of the role of slaves, what men did when they got away from home. Lots of things happening here.
The painting, by the way, was done in the year 1755, 1755年, and the place of the painting was in Rhode Island. Why it was in Rhode Island?
No, it's in South America.
This is the place, the venue.
Suriname. It's in South America.
In South America. Okay.
Where they're trading.
Okay.
They say goodbye to their wives, and they go aboard ship, and they sail to South America, and they trade for goods. Porcelain, Chinese porcelain is one of the things, from the Dutch, which was illegal.
So the painting, the venue of the painting is in a scene in South America, and the date is 1755. But the real painting, the original painting that we see here on the slide is now in the collection of the St. Louis Museum of Art. St. Louis is in, Dora, you're here, right? St. Louis in the state of Missouri.
Right, yeah. We have a grad student who went on exchange in St. Louis,
Oh.
University of Missouri. Yeah.
Ah,
So, don't know if you, when you were in St. Louis, if you got a chance to look at this painting.
Yeah, my daughter is in school in St. Louis too.
Okay. Okay, so we went from the China trade, how Westerners are interested in commercial objects, okay, objects like that big porcelain bowl, and many times the China 瓷器, okay, and from that was in the 18th century. Westerners' interest and imagination of the Far East. I think that's what the Professor Frank was trying to tell us by showing the objects from this painting. Again, the year was 1755. Many of the Africans, okay, were put on slave trips, slave ships, okay, and that's why the venue is in South America. The scene of the painting is in South America. The date is 1755. And her point, however, is the trade of the China porcelain as the real historical objects of the Westerners' imagination of Asia. That does not start from today, but people are talking about 亚洲兴起 or 中国热 that actually was rooted back in the 18th century. And I guess maybe this is the point where we can close with a beautiful artwork. And
If anybody wants to think about coming to Brown University to do a one-year master's degree with me, I oversee the master's program in American Studies, and the students who come would work with me. And I have many students from China. I'd like more students from Taiwan.
of course. Yeah, students, if you are in applied Chinese, right, 印华系同学, you may want to study more about America, right?
Right.
And if you are interested,
They're
or
connected.
anyone else is interested, please go see Professor Frank after the talk. Before we close, I was given the instruction that we should all come forward and have a group portrait picture taken with Professor Frank.
Let me say thank you for
yeah,
listening.
sure.
That was a long talk. Thank you very much for listening. You guys are a great group of students.